So over the next few weeks, we are going to be talking about the book of Ruth. And chances are I'm either going to ruin it or redeem it for you. Hopefully the redeem, chances are it's going to be somewhere in between as we talk about this book. So I'm guessing most of you are somewhat familiar with the story of Ruth and Naomi. If we know anything about the book of Ruth, we know things like it's one of two books of the Bible named after women. We know that it's a happily ever after story. And there's probably a scripture in there that we've heard at a wedding before. And those are probably things that we are familiar with when it comes to the book of Ruth. It is a happily ever after story because it is a story that begins with 6 characters. Their names are, want to shout them out? Oh, come on! Ruth, Naomi, Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, Orpah, and we already got Ruth. That's it, 6 of them. Good job. Yeah, not 6. 6 characters here in this story. And even though it is a happily ever after story, it begins in a very desperate place. It begins with Naomi and Elimelech leaving their homeland because of a famine. And they chase that homeland famine and drought to the land that does have food, to Moab. There in Moab, Naomi's 2 sons, who are Mahlon and Chilion, marry wives who are Moabites. And there's food, and there's family, and things are good, and then things are bad. Elimelech dies, then Naomi's sons also die, and then there's a famine. Things are bad. And in that day and age, in that patriarchal society, when you didn't have a husband, when you didn't have kids, you were on the edge of society. You were not the weakest is not the right word, but the most vulnerable in that society at that time. But thankfully the story continues, and Ruth and Naomi travel back to Bethlehem, and then Bethlehem, Ruth gets married, there's food, there's children, everyone lives happily ever after. And so you get kind of the warm and fuzzies from the story, right? And then there's that part that that Kay read today that you've probably heard at a wedding before. It is Ruth pledging her loyalty and her love to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Where you die, I will die. May this be done to me, even at the cost of death. You ever heard that at a wedding before? Yeah, at a lot of weddings, right. The first time I heard it at a wedding, though, it confused me. Because the first time I heard it at a wedding, it was at a wedding for a man and a woman. But this is a profession of love between a woman and a woman. Anyway, that's a story for a different time. But yeah, so those are the kind of things that we know about the book of Ruth. We know it's a happily ever after story, and we know that bit about that wonderful expression of love that is often heard at weddings. But my hope is we're going to see that there's a little more to this story. And maybe by the end of these few weeks, this story will be ruined for you, but hopefully it'll be redeemed for you. So we need to talk about the setting of this story. The setting of this story of where and when it took place. All right, so it says that it is at the end of the time of Judges. Now, the time of Judges was the time before the time of Kings in the life of the people of Israel. And the time of Judges was not a particularly good time when it came to the end. In fact, the last line in the book of Judges, which is placed immediately before Ruth in the Bible, says that all did what was right in their own eyes. It was like chaos. That's the time in which Ruth is living. And again, and the place is, first it was Bethlehem, which means house of bread. And then it's to Moab, because there was no bread in the house of bread. And Moab is a kind of a neighboring country, but Israel has not looked favorably upon Moab from a historical point of view. I mean, there were some military incursions back and forth, but the belief was that Moab was started by a guy named Moab. But to know about Moab, you have to go back a little further to a guy named Lot. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Who knows who Lot was? Don't just raise your hand, tell me who he was. Abraham's nephew. Right, so Lot was Abraham's nephew. Lot was there at Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife leave Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, his wife turns back and she turns into a pillar of salt, and it just has the 2 daughters. Well, Lot is also the father of Moab. Moab is one of Lot's sons. Lot is also the grandfather of Moab as well, because Lot's daughter is Moab's mother. I'll let y'all figure that out. But that's part of the reason why the Moabites were kind of looked down upon by the Israelites. So for them to go to Moab in the first place is very, very difficult for them to do. And then to return back home, it's hopeful because Naomi's going back home, but she's going with just her daughter-in-law. This was a patriarchal society where truly a woman's worth was established by who she was married to and the children that she had. And at this point, Naomi has none of this. And that's kind of the setting of the place and the time of what's happening here in the story of Ruth. But when the story is set is not necessarily the same time as when the story was written, when it was codified. The story was written down. There's a lot of arguments about it, but one of the theories that I think is true is that the story was written down in the post-exilic time of the people of Israel. Y'all have no idea what that means. So, post-exile is when the people are returning back from Babylon. The people are returning back from Babylon, where they have been in exile for quite some time. And while they were in exile, things changed for them. And the way that things changed is why I think that this book of Ruth was written around that time, because there are many themes in the book of Ruth that deal directly with what was happening in the life of the people as they were coming back from living in exile. While they were living in exile, first of all, you need to understand that the Jewish people believed that exile was their punishment from God, that they had not been devout enough, that they had not been stalwart enough in following the Torah, and so God was punishing them with exile. And while they were living in exile, they decided to do 2 things. They decided, one, we need to be more devout about following Torah, and we need to be more devout about being who we are. And they did it for 2 reasons. One is, again, they were hoping to please God. They thought by not following Torah, they had displeased God. So we're moving with the Jews into a time of very devout and strict religiosity in following the laws of Torah. And they're also living in Babylon. And if they follow the laws of Torah, then they follow what it means to be Jewish. And their Jewish culture doesn't get sucked up by the Babylonian culture. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, when I realized that I was going to be in the ministry, I realized that I was not going to spend the rest of my life in Louisiana, where I had spent 21 years up to that point. And so in all the places that we've lived, I've tried to hold on to that Louisiana culture as much as I can. I've tried to cook a lot of gumbo. I tried to play Boo-Ray, if you actually knows how to play that game. I do all those things. I read Cajun Night Before Christmas to the kids every year at Christmas. Even named our daughter Evangeline after Evangeline and the Evangeline Oak in Louisiana folklore and history. So I understand that desire to really be strong about who you are when you are living among different people. I don't know if any of you Texans have ever moved away. You tend to be more Texan when you move away than when you are in Texas, right? That's kind of what's going on with the Jews. They want to maintain their identity in a foreign land. And so now they are coming back. And they're living in a time where they're trying to reclaim their identity, where they're trying to build up their people, trying to build a new temple, trying to build a wall around Jerusalem. And this story about Ruth, a foreigner, a woman, I think was written around this time because it has so many things that deal with what was happening in the life of the people. I think that if we take all this together, we can actually see the book of Ruth as protest literature. This is protest scripture. This is protesting the racial purity that the Jews were seeking at the time. This is protesting a patriarchal society with strong women. Now, I know it's hard to hear that word, racial purity, when we were thinking about our own ancestors in the faith, but that's exactly what they were doing. At this time, when they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem, they were very strict about how to rebuild Jerusalem. And if you were from Israel, you could only marry women from Israel. If we look in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, it talks about what's happening at this time, and they tell the people that if you are married to a foreigner, like someone from Moab, you have to divorce her. But here we have a story about a woman from Moab who eventually becomes the great-grandmother of David, King David, arguably the greatest king in the history of Israel. And so it is a foreigner that results in the great king of Israel. So it's protesting that idea of racial purity at the time. And when it comes to women, remember, only one of two books in the Bible named after women. And it's not like Ruth is the only person in the story. She ends up marrying a guy named Boaz. Boaz means strength. What a great name. Didn't get the title of the book. Ruth. As we find out, as we read this story about Ruth and Naomi, it is the women who live in a patriarchal society where the men are supposed to take care of the women, and the men are supposed to make all the decisions, and the men are supposed to provide leadership. It is the women in this story who do just that. They actually provide leadership to the men, as we will see, as we look at it over the next few weeks. So as we are looking at this story of Ruth, yes, we need to remember that it is a happily ever after story. Yes, we need to remember that beautiful, beautiful language of commitment and love, but I think we should also look at it as protest literature as well. So this is a story of protest against racial purity, against patriarchy, and it is a story of hesed as well. That's probably a difficult word. Hesed is a Hebrew word that means a lot of different things, but we can call it loving kindness. Hesed is that loving kindness that Ruth exhibits to Naomi when she says those words. Where you go, I go. Your people, my people. Where you dwell, I dwell. Your God, my God. Where you die, I die. That is hesed. That is loving kindness. That is commitment. Now, remember at this time, people believed that God had punished them by sending them into exile. And so they were trying to reclaim their identity to make God happy and pleased with them again. But that story of Ruth reminds us of the story of God's hesed. God's loving kindness for God's people, which never goes away. So as we are looking at this book over the next few weeks, I want to encourage you to look at it with maybe a new set of eyes. Maybe a set of eyes that looks at it as, yes, that wonderful story we all know, but also a story of protest and a story of hesed, loving kindness. And hopefully, by doing this, we won't ruin the story for you, but maybe we'll find new things about it together.